right. Well, welcome, Joanna. You want me to call you Joanna, Joe? What do you like to be called?
Either of those is fine.
Okay, so we have Joanna Grease here today to talk to us about her amazing sensory projects. Welcome, Joanna. It's wonderful to
Thanks for
have
having me.
you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, maybe you could start out just by talking about yourself and your work, and that'll set us a stage to dig deep into some of the really cool things that you're doing.
Okay, so I'm Jo Grace. I run the thing called the Sensory Projects. I'm a sensory engagement and inclusion specialist, which is a made up title, but it describes accurately what I do. I come from a very inclusive background. I have family members who have neurodivergent conditions and physical disabilities. I first worked as a brain worker, as a support worker for a brain injured gentleman when I was 13. I've been a registered foster carer for children with profound special educational needs and disabilities in the UK. But I'm a teacher. There's probably other things that are relevant that you're supposed to say at that point. And the sensory projects, which is my baby, they run on the principle that with the right knowledge and a little bit of creativity, inexpensive resources can be effective tools for inclusion and communication. And so one of the projects is the Sensory Story Project that provides narratives to people who don't necessarily access narrative through language or through pictures. We do narratives through sensation, so that's a fun one. And they're getting kind of out of hand because originally it was just meant to be that one project. It was meant to be the Sensory Stories project, and then that one triggered an art project that triggered another project that triggered another, and I'm only one person, and I'm trying really hard not to think of a new one because there's always something new and exciting to do.
I can relate to that. And that's how you know you're truly inspired by something, right? Because you can't seem to rein yourself in to stop
I'm
taking on more.
Yeah, I'm just so delighted that I get to do it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I had the pleasure of just kind of catching you by surprise. I just kind of found you on the internet because I found a website that was related to sensory stories that was no longer operating. And then discovered you, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. I have never seen this before. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your sensory story project first, and just everything about it, but really also just helping us understand how you've used narratives to help communication.
Okay, I'm definitely not going to tell you everything about it because that would take us like a couple of years. But a sensory story is a concise text. So typically you tell them in sort of 8 to 10 sentences. And each sentence or section of that text is partnered with a rich and relevant sensory experience. And when I create my stories, I really challenge myself to make sure that the sensory, I need two words. I need like a small letter sensory and like a capital letter sensory. It's got to be of interest to the senses alone. So if you had no understanding, no cognition at all, you would still want to look at this thing or touch this thing. Because if I'm sat in a blank space, like if I held up a picture, you might look at that picture, it would hold visual interest, but it's not actually of interest to your eyes, it's of interest to your brain because you know that picture has information in it. So I want something that's of interest just to your eyes and that also has relevance to your brain. And that means that I can use those narratives to share stories with people who don't have the cognitive ability to be curious or to know what might happen next, all of those things. And equally, I can enrich stories for people who do have those capabilities. And I've used sensory stories with most of my work is with people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, but I have done 2 film studies courses at universities where I've just used them straight, not like therapeutically or anything, just told them to film students. I've used them with people with dementia. I wrote a book called Sensory Stories for Children and Teens, and I'm just doing a second edition of that book now. And one of the most exciting things, and like this is like breaking news type stuff, is that there's going to be a story in that book that's been authored by people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, people who would be looked at as not being capable of creating narratives, and they've got a story in the book because one of the things we've been doing on the sensory projects is co-authoring experiences where people with complex disabilities write sensory stories.
Oh, that's exciting. When is that coming out?
Oh, And
When you finish it, right?
if I meet my deadlines, which publishers I definitely will sometime next year, I think. But there's so much, because there's all the benefits of narrative, which are people think of narrative as being like bedtime stories, but there's so much more to it. There's like access to learning, there's understanding of self, your discovery of morals, your identity. All of these things are built from narrative. And then we've been doing another project that I'm just working on recently, is using sensory stories to create access to experiences. So we've been working with a group of kayakers and Exeter University, and Exeter University's remit is to create access to natural experiences for people who might not otherwise be able to access them. And so we have a couple of groups of participants on this project. One group are people who have such complex medical care needs that to go kayaking would be impossible. And the kayaking group that we're working with will get you out on the water. For them to say it's not possible is really saying something. So for these people, the sensory story that we've created with the kayakers, that has all the sensory experiences of going kayaking in, they get to have a kayaking type experience through that story. But we're also using that story with a group of people for whom the sensory aspects of kayaking might create a barrier. And so I have some online training that I do, and I have an online training course about creating sensory accessibility. And I'm looking at sensory accessibility as like physical accessibility, where you would have like ramps and lifts. We also need to be creating sensory access. And so for those people, the opportunity to practice the sensory experiences that are going to be encountered, to know what the sensory experiences are that are going to be encountered, to have that structure, to have the chance to understand it through the sensory story before they go and do it in person, that can create access where before that experience was just too overwhelming and couldn't be accessed. So that's another one.
That's awesome. And it's so, I love that you're thinking about it as far as access and adapting the learning environment, right? And I think that that's a new concept that I've not seen prior to the last couple of maybe year or so, is this idea of not just sensory integration, not just sensory processing treatment, but we need to adapt what we provide as experiences for our kids and young adults who have that as a barrier. So can you paint a little bit of a picture of what a sensory story experience might be?
I really should have one with me, but I'm currently in the process of moving house, or trying to move house, and everything's in boxes. I have a story that I love to tell that's about the formation of stars in stellar nurseries. So the sensory stories on the sensory projects are about all sorts of different topics, but I tend to try and skew to older audiences, or I don't know, more grown-up themes, because there's loads of children's books that you can easily turn into a sensory story. So I wanted to wait, and I also have in my mind like the different sections of the library. Like I want poetry and fiction and romance and all of this. So I have a sensory story called The Birth of a Star, and it was written in conjunction with physicists at the Max Planck Institute, which is like the spiritual home of physics. I think there's been something like 145 Nobel Prizes awarded for physics, and 53 of them have gone to people working from the Max Planck. So it's really like the place of science. And the physicists helped me to write the story, and it's just 7 sentences long. And they are, Max Planck physicists' stamp of authority, accurate to how stars are born in stellar nurseries. And they help me with the sensory experiences that go with it. So the start of that story is before a star is born, it is a huge cloud of hydrogen gas. And the sensory experience that we create with that is we just throw up handfuls of confetti. And the confetti is a brilliant visual stimulus because it's like everywhere. It moves. If you're sort of good at near distance or far distance, there's something there. I sometimes make it out of hole punchings, white hole punchings, and fluoresce it under UV light. And then when you throw it up, it's like a firework going up in the dark. The physicists really liked it as a stimulus because they said the dispersal of particles in the confetti cloud is very similar to the dispersal of particles in the hydrogen cloud. So within that sensory experience, we have scientific accuracy. We're conveying in sensory meaning what is meant in the words. So if you can't access the words, you're still having an aspect of that content conveyed to you. And then the next part of the story is about the gravitational pull that these particles undergo. And the sensory experience for that is really simple. It's a bungee cord that you pull on. And you think, we use those sort of 4 letters of the word pull to abstractly represent a concept that I would argue is way more concrete. You're literally feeling pull, aren't you? The meaning is there. It's the sort of more meaning in the sensory experience than there is in the words. That part of the story is better than the language-based part. And then they pull, and then they and so it goes on. And the final experience of that story, all of my stories are resourced with really simple stuff, because I think if you're trying to be inclusive, but you're using things that somebody else can't afford, you're like, how inclusive are you being? So it's all things like hole punchings. And the final part is where the star is born, and stars when they're born are blue. So it's just torchlight through blue cellophane. But when you look through blue cellophane, that's a massive visual experience, because it changes everything you see. It's huge. It fills your vision. So it's a really gorgeously rich sensory experience, and it's really accurate to the birth of the star narrative. I'm sorry, I haven't got a piece of blue cellophane to hold up over the camera. You should do that.
Yeah, you're painting a beautiful word picture, right? It's
the irony.
Funny, yeah, to try to convey these sensory concepts over an auditory medium, right? Yeah. It's hard, but you're doing a beautiful job. I can almost feel it. I can feel the experience of this big cloud of confetti kind of raining down.
When I do it at events, I do it with a confetti cannon and really get everybody.
It's very cool. So is there anything else you want to share about the sensory story piece before? I have some questions about your multi-sensory rooms as well, but what else would you want to share, and where can we find out how to make these or how to buy these for our kids?
So I have some online training currently about writing and creating sensory stories that you can access via my website, which is just www.thesensoryprojects.co.uk. I also have the book about sensory stories, and I've got a range of sensory stories that I publish myself on the Sensory Projects that you can purchase. If you were thinking about other things that you might want to know about, it could be things to do with communication for people with very profound disabilities. And there are particular ways of sharing the sensory stories that can enable, or I don't want to say enable people with profound disabilities, because it's not changing anything about them. It's enabling us to listen to them better. So there are ways of telling the story that enable us to hear their responses and hear their preferences, and there are ways of telling the stories that can support them in understanding and beginning to anticipate and to know what's happening next in the story. So those are all things that are, if people are curious to look into. You said at the start that you bumped into me on the internet. That is more or less where I live. So you come and find me on Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm there all the time. Maybe might be asleep when you're awake, but I will always respond to messages. I'm very happy to have friend requests and things like that.
And I can attest to that, because I sent Joanna, first I sent you a friend request, and then I took the friend request back, and then I sent you a different one, and then I took that one back, because I was like, should I do this on your personal page or not?
Yes, because this is what I am. I am all of this.
Yeah. So I will attest, she's very responsive, quick to reply, and you just have a wealth of information just available on your website as well. So I imagine some of those tips for communicating are in some of your trainings.
Yes, they absolutely are. And if you go to the where is it? It's the resources section. There's a bunch of little guides that are just like an A4 page trifold leaflet thing that give quick at a glance information that are free to download. And there's a free guide to sharing the sensory stories to download from the sensory stories page. So there's lots of stuff there. Just poke around.
Yeah, I will make sure the link is included for everybody who's interested. So I also wanted to talk about your multi-sensory rooms, because you mentioned those when we were conversing on email. Tell me about that. In a nutshell.
Yeah, that one's slightly different, because I run the Sensory Story Project because I'm the biggest convert to sensory stories there's ever been. I used to be a teacher in a special school, and I had a class of students with severe and profound special educational needs and disabilities, and sensory stories came into my life like a beam of light. They were just amazing. Sensory rooms did not. the sensory room was something like you were supposed to go on a Tuesday and you take your class up there and go, oh, I'm not really sure there's any point to this. I have seen amazing things happen in sensory rooms. I've had wonderful times in sensory rooms, but I was not a natural fan of sensory rooms in the way that I'm a natural fan of sensory stories. I've been running the sensory projects now for, gosh, more than a decade. And all through that time, people will like, they'll message me and go, we've got a new sensory room, Joe, you'd be so excited. Or they'll tag me in a picture of a sensory room. There's a bunch of airports in the UK recently installed sensory rooms, and I've been tagged in those, like, look at this, Joe, isn't this great? And you think, sorry, boxes. and you sort of think, I just sort of didn't say anything about it, and I kept not saying anything about it, and then somebody I know really well said to me, Joe, you have to say something about this. I was like, I don't want to talk about it. And then I had to. So I did a piece of research that looked into the use of sensory rooms in the UK. And it's a small study, but I spoke to, as many people as I could. I interviewed people who use multisensory rooms. So they were parents, they were teachers, they were therapists. And I interviewed them about their experience of using the rooms. And overwhelmingly, they reported being underwhelmed. They reported feeling like there was something about these rooms that they were supposed to be accessing, but weren't. And loads of people, they sort of, sometimes people look at the study and say, oh, she only, asked, I think I had 27 people in the first thing. I asked loads more people than that, but most people turned me down. They said, oh no, we're not using our sensory room right, so we shouldn't answer your questions because we're not doing it right, because we're not getting this thing out of the room, this magic that's promised by these rooms. And so I was looking into why that is, and I've looked into the history of multisensory rooms last year, I think, or maybe the year before, because COVID has confused my brain. My book, Multiple Multisensory Rooms, Myth Busting the Magic, was published. And that book looks at why we have this experience of feeling like we're not getting what we ought to be getting out of our sensory rooms, and where the magic of sensory rooms actually lies. And I think the birthplace of sensory rooms is where you really spot that magic. And there were various people, like all great inventions, different people in different places at a similar time come up with the idea all at once. But the people who are sort of down in history as the start point are some men called, I have to be really careful because I always spoonerize their names. They're called Jan and Ad. I keep calling them Jan and Jan and Ad. And they were working in an old institution. And when people say the word institution, you have a sort of particular vision in your head. If you look at the landscape around care provision and the understanding of people with neurodivergent conditions and disabilities in that time, it's dramatically different to where we are now. In research terms, they're working at a time when people with learning disabilities didn't qualify as human. You were regarded as subhuman or severely subhuman. So that's the sort of atmosphere in which they're working. And they must have been like in their early 20s when they were working in this institution. It's a place that, you send your relatives to be locked up and forget about them. And there's a story about how they came up with the idea. They'd cycled up a mountain on a summer's day. And when they got to the top, they were completely knackered, and they were lying back in the grass, like watching the clouds and watching little bits of dandelion fluff. And they observed that they were noticing these beautiful things, the little bits of fluff, the movement of the clouds, because they were relaxed and because they were exhausted. And they said, isn't this beautiful? Isn't this moment wonderful? I wish we could share this with our friends at the institution. And it's that bit. It's that at a time when other people were looking at those people and not regarding them as human, those two young men on their day off regarded them as friends. And when they bumped into beauty in the world, their reaction was, I want to share this with my friend. And what they describe when they describe early sensory room practice is this process of sharing. And the descriptions of it, when you read it, are very similar to what we would recognize as intensive interaction today. They talk about it being a process of sharing that can be done at any time, in any place. But when they were watching the bits of dandelion fluff, they said it's a shame that we can't share this with our friends, because they wouldn't be able to see the little bit of fluff against the backdrop of the sky, because the contrast isn't there. And so what they did was they put up a tent in the lawns of this institution so that they could create they were creating sensory accessibility, and they brought nature into this tent. So this tent had dried leaves and, herbs and things like this. They've got some amazing contraptions, that like air duct pipe that you get that's like cute. They'd got that dangling over bars, and then one end of it's over a bowl of herbs, and then you can pick up the other end of it and put it over like somebody's face so that they can smell the herbs on the floor that they can't reach. They'd got all this sort of creative stuff going on. And they said the tent is a great place to do this sharing, but you don't need a tent. You can do this anytime. And it had an amazing effect, because people who weren't being treated like they were human were treated like they were friends, people wanted to have conversations with them. They wanted to share things that were important with them. And when you read Yadanand's writing, they write in just so much respect for those people. Things that they write in the sort of late 70s would still sound contemporary, revolutionary today, with the regard that they had for those people. And bless them, I think they probably spent their whole lives from then going, it's not about the tent, because people saw these disabled people sort of relaxing or vocalizing or speaking or behaving in ways that they'd never behaved before. And they went, wow, this tent's amazing. How have you made this tent? And Yadananda going like, it's not about the tent, but we just put it up like this. And then it got to winter, and the institution recognized how valuable their work in the tent was. So they gave them a room in the building, and it became a sensory room. And from that point, or possibly from the point a little while later where a particular company trademarked the name of that room, it became a product, it became a room, it became equipment. And it was never equipment, it was never a room, it was always the people and the connection between the people. And when we go into these spaces expecting the room to do something, or working out how to use the equipment, we're missing that bit. And when I was talking to people, everybody had received training on how to operate the room, how to switch it on, how to switch it off, how to make this effect. Nobody had received training on how to use it. And I've put up some online training about multisensory rooms that's just a bunch of questions. I've had feedback from people who've done it, and it seems to create some sort of argument in people's heads. One person said it was really frustrating and brilliant. You're like, oh, I'm not sure if that's good feedback or bad. And then another person said it was nothing that I wanted and everything that I needed. Again, I'm sat there thinking, I don't know if that's good. But it doesn't answer any questions, it just asks loads of questions to get you thinking about the rooms.
Yeah, I could see how that would be frustrating, but maybe that's where the learning comes from, right? Is sitting in those moments of not knowing the answer to something.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's like a bit of an overlap between your research on these multisensory rooms and your perspectives on just sensory experience, and that really becomes about the strategy and the relationship and less about the stuff.
Yeah.
So what would you say, in thinking about like your top tips? I'm going to put you on the spot with tips, but you can take a minute to think about them. Okay. What would be your top tips on those strategies of either bringing accessibility for people who have sensory barriers, or changing mindset and approach to help use these tools and products better? Broad question, but really just kind of narrowing in on tips or strategies.
To use the products better, you start from the person, not from the catalogue. So you don't flick through the catalogue and think, oh, what would I like? You look at the person and think, what would be useful to them? I need to find something that does this. And you might find that in the catalogue. You might equally find that in your local hardware store or at a recycling depot, and the stuff done with blankets thrown over tables and cardboard boxes can be as magical as the stuff done in amazing immersive rooms. For sensory accessibility, the tip would be to get as accurate a representation of the sensory experience that you're trying to give accessibility to as possible. So like with the kayaking story, it's no good sort of telling somebody they're going to be walking barefoot on wet sand. They need to have access to that sensation to be able to practice it. And I'm not saying practice it because the practicing will change what it feels like for them. There's a school of thought that says that if you repeatedly have a sensory experience, that you can learn to process it. Some people can, and some people will never be able to do that. But within that practicing, you could explore strategies that you might use. You like, okay, what if you kept your socks on? Because you could go kayaking with your socks on. It's not what people ordinarily do, but if that's a strategy that works for you, we can discover those strategies through the opportunity of you having this experience. So you need an accurate experience. With creating sensory engagement, which is what a lot of my sensory stories are doing, that I want you to be in the story and I want you to have this sensation. Partly it's about choosing the experience, which is what I was talking about before, but a lot of it is about the backgrounding to that experience. So for example, I'm sitting against this blank wall. That makes me a very clear visual experience on your screen, but actually if I'm somebody who struggles with visual processing, this wall is like a pale color. It throws off a lot of light, and when you process vision, your retina is processing light, and I'm asking you to process all of this light when you don't really need to be doing that. I'd be much more visually accessible sat against like a matte gray wall or a darker color wall. So the backdrop to a sensory experience can sort of make or break it in terms of how engaging and interesting it is. And actually a good backdrop can raise like quite a simple experience up to something glorious. So yeah, backdrop. What were my tips? Backdrop, accuracy, and there was another one that
starting with the person. Person. Yeah.
Oh, that's the best one.
That's the best one, most important one, right? Because from that, you're getting all of these other things, right? What does my student need visually, auditorily, tactily? I love that. And I love the idea of rehearsing and practicing the sensory experience to discover some of those challenges that might pop up. And some things that create fear and anxiety perhaps in the parent or the teacher that might want to provide an experience for a child who has sensory barriers, they can be addressed in that practice, right? So then it doesn't become cutting the opportunity off.
It becomes a creative challenge to you as well then, because it's not just the ask isn't just that the child change how they perceive that perception. The ask is, okay, what strategies are you going to suggest if they don't like that sensation? Like, I dislike the sensation of eating mushrooms. My strategy is I pick the mushrooms off my pizza. That strategy works. But if I don't like the sensation of, I don't know, walking on carpet, what strategies are you going to come up with? Each solution is going to be different. So you need to be sort of thinking on your feet and thinking creatively to join in with that experience and be useful to the child.
Yeah. And as I hear you describe both this accessible practice, but then the act of reading the stories for narrative, all these communication opportunities are just like fireworks popping in my head, which is the experience I had listening to you at the first.
They're so much fun. When I do them with people with profound multiple learning disabilities, try and tell them in the same way each time so that they can orientate themselves to the experience and begin to anticipate it and react to it and communicate back. And I do a lot of work around that. But I've done them in like mainstream schools, and I've done one where you have like a sensory storyline. So I've had like quite small props, and I just take in a travel washing line. So you just have a piece of string with pegs on. And once I've finished sharing the sensory experience for the first sentence of the story, I'll peg it on the washing line and so on. So by the end of it, you've got the story written on your washing line. And obviously I put them left to right. I can't work out which way I have to point to make it look left to right on yours. But then a child can go along and they can access those experiences. They could take them down off the washing line and play with them themselves, or they could access them on the line. And what they're doing when they do that is they are taking in units of meaning left to right along a line. But when you make the line a rope, a concrete thing in the world, it's more tangible, it's more accessible than a line on a page. And you think of like what we ask children to do when they read. We give them a load of text like that, there aren't actually lines there. We just imagine the lines, and we're supposed to go left to right like that's normal. What's normal for our eyes to do when we see a sheet of text like this is to drop down the little white rivulets of space that just naturally occur, because that's like a pattern of raindrops. And you'll find quite often with dyslexic readers that their eyes will just drop through a hole in the text onto the next line. So practicing that skill of tracking left to right along a line before you're asked to do it as a reading skill is really valuable. And you can, like all of those sort of worksheet type activities that you would get in primary school, if I take one of those things off the line and then mix it up with 2 or 3 other things on the floor, it's that close exercise, isn't it? When you've got the word missing in the sentence and you have to choose the word from the box. You can practice these literacy skills in a sensory landscape that doesn't rely on your ability to use language. And I think when we define literacy as the sequencing and sharing of words, we exclude from literacy a group of people who would never be able to do that. And when we recognize that words are just one tool that we use for expressing meaning, and that there are loads of other tools that can be equally as valid, then we open it all up and we get just like more people to the party.
So what kinds of things are on your line? Is it the tools you're using in your, like, you're like, what kinds of things are not on my line?
Nothing glamorous. I've got a book that I wrote about using sensory stories and conversations with people with dementia. And the front cover of that book is one of my washing lines. And I was looking at it at the cover and thinking, I'm not sure if it's still, what was on that one? There was I've got you know, the little jingle bells that are on like hats at Christmas. I've got a massive one of them, like not golf ball, cricket ball size jingle bell goes on the line. That's fun to play with. I've got I was walking through a cookery shop and there were these different types of pads for washing your cookware. And I was just feeling them as I go through the shop, because that's how I shop. You get the announcement in the supermarket. There's a lady in aisle 5 who's sniffing all of the different shampoo bottles. And I'm not stealing anything. Just checking the sensory experiences in my shopping. I touched this like washcloth thing and it just felt really like nothing I touched. So that's on the washing line. There might be a bit of cellophane. They don't look like anything. It's not. This is the thing about the sensory rooms again, isn't it? The sensory rooms look amazing, but actually the experience isn't about what it looks like. It's about, the experience is about what looking is like, you know. And when I do the looking through my piece of cellophane, that's a massive looking experience. And okay, it doesn't look like much, it just looks like a piece of cellophane, but the looking is fantastic. So yeah, just odds and sods on my washing lines.
That's amazing. Well, is there anything else you want to share about your work before we wrap up today?
Oh gosh, millions of it, loads of it, all of it. I think the thing to know that's possibly relevant is that I'm autistic, and that my brain's capacity to focus and to draw in lots of different sources of information is one of the reasons that I'm successful at what I do. And I probably ought to say that because it's relevant, and that's it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I actually learned from your last talk that you and your oldest child wrote a book together, correct?
He's the UK's youngest published author. He wrote it when he just turned 5, and it was just written when it was published. We had reporters come to our house, and one of them said to him, "Do you suffer from having an autistic mummy?" And he just looked at this man like he's turned into a pig or something. He didn't understand the question. And I was really shocked by it. And I was thinking about it afterwards, and I was thinking, gosh, does he suffer from having an autistic mummy? And then I realized what he suffers from is having a primary school teacher for a mummy, because that's why it was. I was looking for ways to make him interested in keeping writing through his summer holiday, on his first summer holiday from school. And we had this experience in a supermarket, and I'd explained that was to do with me being autistic, and I tried to explain it to him. And then when I was checking to see if he'd understood me, he drew me a picture of me and him in the supermarket to explain it to me. And I said, oh, that's a very good picture, you know. And if you write a sentence underneath it, hint, hint, let's do a sentence underneath the picture. And then the next day I was like, maybe we could do another picture. And I said to him, we'll stick them all together and make a book. I was just thinking we'd show it to grandma, and I got to the end of the holidays and you look at it and you think, I think this is really good. But I'm his mummy, so of course I do. Like, I think the sun shines out of his tiny bottom. So I sent it to my publishers, and it has to go through committees and things like that. So other people, aside from his mummy, thought it was really good. And it's called My Mummy is Autistic, and it looks at the language processing differences that I experience. And it's a celebration of neurodiversity. It's a nice one because it's a child's perspective of an adult. It's not saying that autism is a thing of childhood that we will fix. It's just a celebration of difference. Yeah.
And that's what I loved most about it, was that it was from your son's perspective, and so much just experience coming through those beautiful drawings.
That's it. All the cheerful felt tip pen, like very 5-year-old drawings there.
It's
I
gorgeous.
think I've got like my 5 fingers in all of them.
He didn't leave any off.
Yeah.
That's good. That's great. Well, Joanna, it's been so wonderful. I could talk to you all day. You have warmth and just brightness that comes from you when you speak about what you do. And I hope to talk to you again about another passion, heart project that you spin off on. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to get to do what I do. I think that's what you're picking up on. I'll always come and talk about it again.
Wonderful.